So now we're going to just look at some concepts that you should really know before you play the dragon. And we're going to do this by jumping into the position at a certain point and just going to the critical moment and showing you what you should play if you ever face this in your games, and the concepts in general that you should try to reinforce in your head when you're playing this opening. So the first game we're going to look at is a game played between Geller with the white pieces and Korchnoi with the black pieces, so another Korchnoi game. And this was played in the candidates again, so the World Championships run-up in 1971. So even though it was played in 1971, it really demonstrates an important idea that black has. So in this position, black has just played knight to e5, and this is basically the Saltist variation, which we've seen before. Now, the main line here will be something like h4 when I'm recommending h5 in the theory section. But here, Geller played the slightly dubious bishop to h6 move. Now, this is a mistake because of black's reply, and black's reply should be something that should become second nature to you. If you ever get a chance to do what black does here, then generally it's a good idea. So after bishop to h6, we now come up with a typical dragon exchange sacrifice here. We go bishop takes h6, diverting white's queen away from the queen side, queen takes h6, and now we play the important rook takes c3. And even though this basically loses the exchange for black, sacrifices the exchange, a much better word, it destroys white's queen side. That's the first thing that is very good, so black now has some targets to attack. And also, very importantly, it gets rid of a very good attacking piece, white's knight on c3, which often comes to d5, and the idea of swapping off black's good defensive knight, the knight on f6. It's worth remembering that black's knight on f6 is one of his best defensive pieces because it defends the h7 pawn. So if you can think in the future, when white is able to open up the h-file, black's knight on f6 defends h7. So this knight, very important piece for that defensive job. So how did the game continue? Well, it continued, pawn takes rook. The number of ways that black can continue his initiative here. A normal response would be queen to c7 here, attacking c3, but Korchnoi now played a5, which is an interesting idea. He's using his pawns as well, and his idea is just to trap the white bishop with pawn to a4. So white decided to stop this, he went pawn to a4 himself, and now let's just see some more typical ideas and see how it develops. Queen to c7, attacking the pawn on c3. White now has to retreat his queen to e3, so he's already going on defensive in order to defend this, queen to e3. Black now moved his queen slightly nearer to the white king, queen to c5, also pinning the knight on d4, which is useful. King to d2, white decided he should try to run away, his king's much too basically unstable on the queen side. I mean, black's idea in this position is probably to continue with something like rook to c8, maybe pawn to b5, and at the right moment, knight to c4. This is a generally good way for black to continue his attack in this position. And initiative is key in a lot of these positions. In this position, black has the initiative. You're attacking opposite sides of the board, so whoever gets the initiative is the one who's going to generally have the better position. So king to d2, and now let's just see a couple more moves. This does give away a pawn. Bishop takes a4, rook to a1. Can't take this bishop because the knight to c4 check. Rook to a1. Bishop takes b3. Pawn takes b3. And now, after black's next move, I think black was slightly better. And we can see one more typical idea in the dragon. Korchnoi now play pawn to d5. A typical dragon break. You have to remember this move, pawn to d5. It crops up time and time again. The reason black plays it here is to open up the d-file towards white's king, to try to give his knight a good square on d5, and generally open up the position. So d5, an important concept. The three things you should remember there: if white plays a premature bishop to h3, always consider taking the bishop and then sacrificing the exchange on c3 to gain the initiative. And when you get this initiative, remember this ideas are going a5 and even d5 when you get a chance. So let's now move on to another important concept that you should really understand before playing the dragon. So we're now going to come to the second important concept that I want you to try to understand before taking up the dragon. It's actually quite similar to the last one, this exchange sacrifice on c3. which I expect most people know about anyway. But and then in the last example, we saw this exchange sacrifice happen when white had castled queenside. Now, you can actually also consider doing this sacrifice when white has castled kingside in a more positional way, because you don't tend to just open up white's king and checkmate white. But often you can do this sacrifice to gain good play in the centre and gain this pawn on e4. So we have now a different setup than we've looked at so far in this DVD. This is a setup when white's castled and places pawns in the centre of the board. And this is a game between Sergei Dalyok versus Vladimir Malakhov, and it's played in the Russian Championships in 1995. But it's a textbook example of what black should do in the certain positions. So it's white to move here, and white now played pawn to f5. Now, this is a very committal move. It's not necessarily a bad move, but it's very committal because it gives away this big e5 square. Okay, so Malakhov decided just to retreat his bishop to d7, and now white's continued with his theme of hacking on the king side by playing pawn to g4. Now, this is considered actually to be a bit too over-committal now, because we'll see later on that as white's king is on the king side, he's really going to open up and find that it's going to be too exposed. So Malakhov decided to play in very standard fashion, knight to e5, controlling the square. Knight to d2 was now played. g5 would be answered by the same move, knight to d2, and now we see another example of this typical exchange sacrifice. Black now played rook takes c3. So sacrificing exchange, but more positionally than the last game, to basically destroy white's pawn structure and gain pressure against white's centre. So white just had to take this, pawn takes c3, and now black continued with his idea of pressuring the centre, bishop to c6, threatening knight takes e4, and with good compensation. Now, white now played a slightly dubious move. He went bishop to f3. Okay, it's not clear what he should do. It's very hard to defend this pawn on e4. If he went bishop to d3, black can now take the pawn on g4 with very good play. So he did go bishop to f3, which looks quite logical. And now black just played knight takes f3 check, queen takes f3, and another important concept to get to grips with in this position, very similar to the last game. After our initial sacrifice on c3, we have to follow this up with active play. Hopefully you can remember the break that black's going for here already. Remember the break? Something to do with those pawns in the centre. Pawn to d5. Yep, that's the move. Opening up the light squared bishop and really sort of blowing away white's centre here. And black has very good position here. The game continued. Bishop d4. D takes e4. Queen to h3, and now a nice tactic, knight takes g4, which takes advantage of this bishop on d4. Basically, black's on the verge of winning here with this, and it's all starting to stem from this exchange sacrifice. And we can see black did it more in positional ways here because he really wanted to take over white's pawn structure. And I'd really say you can only do this sacrifice on c3 when white is castle kingside, when white does overextend himself. Let's just have, I mean, in this position, for example, if white did play queen takes g4, then black can just go bishop takes d4 check, picking up the knight on d2, or the rook on a1 in some variations. And, well, what actually happened in the game was that white took on g7, bishop takes g7, but then after king takes g7, well, basically, white's in a lot of trouble here. The queen coming out to b6, queen takes knight, etc. And black went on to win the game very convincingly. So again, always bear in mind the sacrifice on c3. You can do it for tactical reasons, white castles queenside, and you can do it for positional reasons as well if you want to try to gain a play in the centre of the board. Okay, time to move on to the next important concept. Let's go for it.